Imagine being so desperate for freedom that you'd risk everything twice, knowing one mistake means death row. You're about to discover how one of America's most notorious killers pulled off not one, but 2 prison escapes in just 6 months. What made him think he could outsmart an entire justice system? How did he vanish from a courtroom in broad daylight? And what fatal error finally ended his run? The second escape almost worked. Ted Bundy wasn't supposed to escape. He was locked up in Utah, facing a kidnapping conviction and mounting evidence that connected him to multiple murders across several states. But Ted had something most prisoners didn't have: charm, intelligence, and an unshakable belief that he was smarter than everyone else. By early 1977, investigators from Washington, Colorado, and Utah had compared notes. They knew Ted was their guy. The problem was proving it in court. Colorado authorities had charged him with the murder of Karen Campbell, a young nurse who disappeared from a ski resort. They wanted him transferred to Aspen for trial. Ted agreed to the move, waiving his right to fight extradition. It seemed like a surrender, but Ted Bundy never surrendered. He was already planning something that would shock the nation, because in Ted's mind, freedom wasn't just possible, it was inevitable. On January 8, 1977, Ted Bundy arrived in Aspen, Colorado. He was no longer in the high-security Utah State Prison. Instead, he was being held in the Garfield County Jail in Glenwood Springs, a small facility that wasn't built for someone like him. The jail was old, understaffed, and far less secure than where he'd been before. Ted noticed this immediately. He studied the guards, their routines, their weaknesses. He observed the layout of the building, the location of the exits, the timing of shift changes. To everyone else, Ted seemed calm, even cooperative. He spent his days preparing for trial, reading law books, and acting like a man ready to fight his case. But inside, he was doing something else entirely. He was mapping out his first escape. Ted had been given a privilege that most inmates never received. Because he was representing himself in court, he was allowed to visit the law library. And that library had something Ted desperately needed: a way out. June 7, 1977. Ted Bundy was transported from the Garfield County Jail to the Pitkin County Courthouse in Aspen for a preliminary hearing. He was dressed in casual clothes, no prison uniform. Because he was acting as his own attorney, the judge had excused him from wearing handcuffs or leg shackles. Ted looked like any other lawyer preparing for a case. During a recess, he asked the guards if he could visit the courthouse law library to research his defense. They agreed. It seemed like a reasonable request. Ted walked into the library on the second floor, flanked by 2 guards who waited near the entrance. He moved toward a bookcase, pretending to search for legal materials. The guards couldn't see him clearly from where they stood, and that's when Ted made his move. He opened a window, climbed onto the ledge, and jumped. He fell 25 feet to the ground below, landing hard on his right ankle. Pain shot through his leg, but he didn't stop. He got up and ran. Aspen erupted into chaos. Within minutes, roadblocks were set up around the town. Police officers swarmed the area, search dogs were deployed, and helicopters circled overhead. But Ted Bundy was already gone. He had shed his outer layer of clothing to change his appearance and was limping south through the streets of Aspen, heading toward the mountains. His ankle throbbed with every step, but adrenaline kept him moving. He knew he had only a small window of time before the entire region was locked down. Ted reached the base of Aspen Mountain and began climbing. The terrain was steep and unforgiving, but he pushed forward, using trees and rocks to pull himself upward. Near the summit, he found a small hunting cabin. It was empty. He broke in, desperate for supplies. Inside, he found canned food, warmer clothing, and a rifle. He ate, changed, and rested for a few hours. Then he continued south, deeper into the wilderness, believing he could hike his way to freedom. But Ted had made a critical mistake. He wasn't a survivalist, and these mountains were about to become his prison. For 2 days, Ted Bundy wandered aimlessly through the Colorado wilderness. He had intended to hike south to the town of Crested Butte, where he hoped to steal a car and disappear. But he got lost. The forest was dense, the trails were confusing, and his injured ankle made every step excruciating. He missed 2 separate trails that would have led him down the mountain to safety. Helicopters buzzed overhead, and search teams combed the area below, but the thick tree cover kept him hidden. On June 10th, 3 days after his escape, Ted stumbled upon a camping trailer near Maroon Lake, about 10 miles south of Aspen. He was starving, exhausted, and freezing. He broke into the trailer and found food and a warm ski parka. He devoured the food and rested. But instead of continuing south as planned, Ted made another mistake. He turned around and started walking back north toward Aspen. Maybe he was disoriented. Maybe he thought the search had moved on. Whatever the reason, it was a fatal error. On June 13th, 6 days after his escape, Ted Bundy walked to the edge of an Aspen golf course and found an unlocked car. He was cold, sleep-deprived, and limping badly. His ankle was swollen, possibly fractured, and he was in constant pain. But he had a car, and that meant hope. He drove back into Aspen, trying to stay calm, trying to blend in. But his driving gave him away. The car weaved in and out of its lane, swerving slightly as Ted struggled to stay focused. 2 Aspen police officers noticed and pulled him over. At first, they thought he was just another drunk driver, but when they ran his information and checked the vehicle, everything clicked. The car was stolen, and the man behind the wheel was Ted Bundy, one of the most wanted fugitives in America. Ted tried to run. He bolted from the car, but the officers tackled him to the ground within seconds. His 6-day escape was over. He was taken back to jail, this time under much tighter security. But Ted wasn't done. Not even close. After his first escape, Ted Bundy became a celebrity. News outlets across the country covered the story, and his face was everywhere. Some people were horrified. Others were bizarrely fascinated. Ted, for his part, seemed to enjoy the attention. Back in the Garfield County jail, he was placed under stricter supervision. But it wasn't enough. The jail simply wasn't equipped to hold someone as determined as Ted Bundy. He had tasted freedom, and he wanted it back. But this time, he would be smarter, more patient, more calculated. Ted began working on a new escape plan almost immediately. He knew the jail's layout by now. He knew the guards' schedules, their blind spots, their weaknesses. And he had something else working in his favor: visitors. One visitor in particular, Carol Ann Boone, a woman Ted had met years earlier while working in Washington. Carol believed in Ted's innocence. She visited him regularly, and over the course of several months, she smuggled in $500 in cash. Ted also acquired a detailed floor plan of the jail and a hacksaw blade from other inmates. He was building his toolkit, and he was ready to disappear again. By late 1977, Ted's trial was becoming a major event in Aspen. The small mountain town was overwhelmed by media attention, and Ted's defense team argued that he couldn't get a fair trial there. They filed a motion for a change of venue, requesting that the trial be moved to Denver. On December 23rd, the judge granted the motion. But instead of Denver, the trial would be moved to Colorado Springs, a city known for juries that were harsh on murder defendants. Ted's lawyers were concerned. They knew a Colorado Springs jury might be more likely to convict and impose the death penalty. Ted, however, had other plans. He had no intention of standing trial in Colorado Springs, or anywhere else, for that matter, because by then, his second escape plan was nearly complete. He had lost 35 pounds, starving himself intentionally. He had sawed a small hole in the ceiling of his cell, about 1 square foot in size, just large enough for his now thinner body to fit through, and he had been exploring the crawl space above his cell for weeks, moving around at night while other inmates showered, testing rotes, finding weaknesses. Ted was almost ready. He just needed the right moment. December 30th, 1977. It was the night before New Year's Eve, and the Garfield County Jail was operating with a skeleton crew. Most of the staff had taken time off for the Christmas holiday, and many non-violent prisoners had been granted furlough to spend time with their families. The jail was quieter than usual. Ted Bundy knew this was his chance. That evening, during the dinner hour, Ted made his move. He piled books and files on his bed, arranging them carefully under a blanket to create the shape of a sleeping body. Then he climbed onto his bunk, pushed aside the ceiling tile, and squeezed through the narrow hole he had cut weeks earlier. His body barely fit, but he made it through. He crawled into the darkness above, moving carefully through the crawl space, following a route he had memorized. He knew exactly where he was going. Directly above him was the apartment of the chief jailer. And that night, the jailer was out with his wife. The apartment was empty. Ted broke through the ceiling into the apartment, dropped down into the living room, and stood in silence for a moment, catching his breath. He had done it. He was free. Again, Ted moved quickly through the jailer's apartment, searching for anything useful. He found civilian clothes in a closet and changed out of his jail uniform. He looked like an ordinary man now, not an escaped prisoner. He walked to the front door, opened it calmly, and stepped outside into the cold December night. No alarms, no guards. No one even noticed. Ted walked down the street, away from the jail, feeling the rush of freedom once again. But this time, he wasn't going to make the same mistakes. He wasn't going to wander aimlessly through the mountains. He had a plan. He found an unlocked car parked nearby and stole it. Then he drove east, out of Glenwood Springs, heading toward the interstate. He was careful, driving at a steady speed, not drawing attention. But the stolen car had problems. It broke down in the mountains along Interstate 70, leaving Ted stranded in the freezing cold. A passing motorist stopped and offered him a ride. Ted accepted, keeping his composure, acting like a stranded traveler. The motorist drove him to Vail, about 60 miles to the east. From there, Ted caught a bus to Denver, and from Denver, he boarded a flight to Chicago. By the time the jail discovered he was missing the next day, Ted Bundy was already 1,000 miles away. The skeleton crew at the Garfield County Jail didn't discover Ted's escape until noon on December 31st, more than 17 hours after he had climbed through the ceiling. When a guard finally checked his cell and pulled back the blanket, they found only books and files. Ted Bundy was gone. Again, law enforcement agencies across the country were notified immediately. The FBI joined the manhunt. Roadblocks were set up, airports were monitored, and Ted's face was plastered across every news station in America. But Ted had a head start, and he was moving fast. From Chicago, he took a train to Ann Arbor, Michigan, where he spent a night in a local tavern, blending in with college students. Then he stole another car and drove south to Atlanta, Georgia. From Atlanta, he boarded a Greyhound bus and traveled to Tallahassee, Florida. On the morning of January 8, 1978, Ted Bundy stepped off the bus in Tallahassee and took a deep breath. He was nearly 3,000 miles from Colorado. He had no money, no identification, and no plan. But he was free, and for now, that was enough. Ted checked into a cheap hotel for one night, then found a boarding house near the Florida State University campus. He rented a room under the fake name Chris Hagen and paid in cash. The boarding house was run by a friendly older man who didn't ask too many questions. Ted kept to himself, coming and going quietly, trying not to draw attention. He told himself he would lie low, find a legitimate job, and start a new life. He believed he could stay hidden in Florida indefinitely as long as he didn't do anything to attract police attention. For a few days, it seemed like it might work. But Ted Bundy couldn't help himself. He had spent years living a double life, hiding his darkest urges behind a mask of charm and normalcy. And now, alone in a new city with no structure, no accountability, and no one watching, those urges came roaring back. Ted applied for a construction job, but had to abandon the application when they asked for identification. Without a real identity, he couldn't work. Without work, he had no money. And without money, he had to steal. Ted started shoplifting food and supplies from local stores. He stole credit cards from women's purses left unattended in shopping carts. But it wasn't enough. The darkness inside him was growing, and Tallahassee was about to pay the price. January 15, 1978. It was just after 2 in the morning, and the campus of Florida State University was quiet. Most students were asleep, recovering from the weekend. The Chi Omega sorority house sat on a tree-lined street, its residents tucked safely in their beds. Or so they thought. Ted Bundy approached the house from the rear, moving silently through the shadows. He had been wandering the streets for hours, drinking, building up the courage for what he was about to do. He found a back door with a faulty lock and slipped inside. The house was dark and still. Ted moved through the hallways like a ghost, listening for any sound. He climbed the stairs to the second floor, where the bedrooms were located. Then he entered the first room. Inside, 21-year-old Margaret Bowman was asleep. Ted grabbed a piece of oak firewood he had brought with him and struck her in the head with brutal force. She never woke up. He then strangled her with a nylon stocking, making sure she was dead. Ted moved to the next room. 20-year-old Lisa Levy was also asleep. Ted attacked her with the same savage violence, beating her unconscious, strangling her, and sexually assaulting her with a hair mist bottle. He bit deeply into her left buttock, leaving a mark that would later become crucial evidence. But Ted wasn't finished. Ted moved to another bedroom, where 2 more women were sleeping. 21-year-old Kathy Kleiner and 21-year-old Karen Chandler shared the room. Ted attacked Kleiner first, striking her in the face with the firewood. Her jaw shattered. He then turned to Chandler and hit her as well, breaking her jaw and knocking out several teeth. Both women were severely injured but alive. At that moment, a car pulled up outside the house, its headlights sweeping across the bedroom wall. Ted froze. He could hear voices outside. Panic set in. He dropped the firewood and fled the room, rushing down the stairs and out the back door. The entire attack had taken less than 15 minutes. 4 women attacked, 2 dead, 2 critically injured, and more than 30 people in the house, none of whom heard a thing. It was a level of brutality that stunned even experienced homicide detectives. But Ted still wasn't done. Just 8 blocks away, he broke into a basement apartment and attacked another woman, 21-year-old Cheryl Thomas. He beat her so severely that her jaw and skull were fractured in 5 places. She survived, but the attack left her permanently deaf in one ear and ended her dance career. Then Ted disappeared back into the night. The next morning, Tallahassee woke up to a nightmare. News of the Chi Omega murders spread quickly, and the city was gripped by fear. Police launched a massive investigation, interviewing witnesses, collecting evidence, and trying to piece together what had happened. One witness, a Chi Omega resident named Nita Neary, had seen a man leaving the house around 3 in the morning. She described him as wearing a dark jacket and a knit cap, carrying something in his hand. She couldn't see his face clearly, but she remembered enough to help police create a composite sketch. Detectives also found crucial physical evidence at the scene. In Lisa Levy's room, they discovered bite marks on her body. Forensic experts photographed the marks and took measurements, hoping they could later match them to a suspect's teeth. On Cheryl Thomas's bed, police found a pantyhose mask with 2 hairs inside. The hairs would later be compared to samples taken from suspects. But at that moment, police had no idea who they were looking for. Ted Bundy was still living under the name Chris Hagen. Just a few blocks from the crime scene, he had gotten away with it. For now, Ted tried to lay low after the Chi Omega murders, but he was spiraling. He had no money, no food, and no plan. He continued stealing credit cards and shoplifting, but it wasn't sustainable. He was also drinking heavily, trying to drown out the guilt and paranoia that followed him everywhere. Deep down, Ted knew he couldn't stay hidden forever. The national media was still running stories about his escape from Colorado. His picture was everywhere. Someone would recognize him eventually, but Ted couldn't stop himself. The urges were too strong. On February 8th, just 3 weeks after the Chi Omega attacks, Ted stole a Florida State University van and drove 150 miles east to Jacksonville. He was hunting again. In a shopping mall parking lot, he approached a 14-year-old girl named Leslie Parmenter. He introduced himself as Richard Burton from the fire department and tried to lure her away. But Leslie's older brother arrived and confronted Ted, asking what he wanted. Ted backed off immediately, got back in the van, and drove away. He had been caught off guard, and he knew it was too risky to stick around, so he turned the van around and drove west, back toward Tallahassee. But he didn't go home. Instead, he stopped in a small town called Lake City. February 9th, 1978. Lake City Junior High School was having a normal Thursday morning. Students moved between classes, chatted in hallways, and prepared for another day of lessons. 12-year-old Kimberly Leach was in her homeroom when she realized she had forgotten her purse in another building. Her teacher gave her permission to go retrieve it. Kimberly left the classroom and walked across campus toward the portable classrooms, where she had left her purse earlier that morning. She was seen by several students and teachers as she walked, but she never made it back to homeroom. Somewhere between the portable classrooms and her homeroom, Kimberly Leach vanished. Teachers noticed she was missing and assumed she had gone home sick. Her parents were called, but they hadn't seen her. Panic set in. Police were notified, and a massive search began. Volunteers combed the campus and surrounding areas, searching for any sign of the missing girl. But there was nothing. Kimberly Leach had simply disappeared. What no one knew at the time was that Ted Bundy had been watching the school that morning. He had parked the stolen van nearby and waited. When he saw Kimberly walking alone, he acted. Witnesses later reported seeing a man matching Ted's description near the school that morning. Some saw a white van driving erratically through the area. One witness saw a man forcing a young girl into a van, but they didn't realize what they were seeing until it was too late. Ted drove Kimberly out of Lake City, heading west toward Suwannee River State Park. What happened next is almost too horrific to describe. Ted raped and murdered Kimberly in the van, then dumped her body in an abandoned, pig-farrowing shed deep in the woods. For 7 weeks, Kimberly's family held out hope that she was still alive. Search teams scoured the region, following every lead, but found nothing. Then, on March 25th, a state worker discovered a small shoe near the pig shed. Inside, they found Kimberly's partially mummified remains. The medical examiner determined that her throat had been cut and her genitals had been mutilated with a knife. It was a level of cruelty that defied comprehension. Kimberly Leach was 12 years old, and Ted Bundy had stolen her life without a second thought. By mid-February, Ted knew he was running out of time. His rent was overdue, he had no money, and he could feel the walls closing in. On February 12th, he stole another car and fled Tallahassee, driving west across the Florida Panhandle. He had no destination in mind. He was just running. For 3 days, he drove aimlessly, stealing gas and food along the way. He was exhausted, paranoid, and desperate. On the night of February 15th, around 1 in the morning, Ted was driving through Pensacola, a city near the Alabama state line. He was behind the wheel of an orange Volkswagen Beetle he had stolen days earlier. A Pensacola police officer named David Lee ran the license plate and discovered the car was stolen. Lee turned on his lights and pulled Ted over. When Lee approached the car and told Ted he was under arrest, Ted snapped. He kicked Lee's legs out from under him and bolted, sprinting down the street. Lee fired 2 warning shots into the air, then gave chase. The 2 men struggled violently. Ted tried to grab Lee's gun, but the officer was stronger. He tackled Ted to the ground and handcuffed him. Ted was caught. Again. And this time, there would be no escape. Officer Lee had no idea who he had just arrested. He thought Ted was just another car thief. But when Lee searched the stolen Volkswagen, he found something that made his blood run cold. Inside the car were 21 stolen credit cards, all belonging to female Florida State University students. There were also 3 sets of student identification cards, a stolen television, and a pair of dark-rimmed glasses. In the back seat, Lee found a pair of plaid slacks that matched the description of clothing worn by a man who had tried to abduct a teenage girl in Jacksonville days earlier. Lee radioed for backup and took Ted to the Pensacola jail. As they drove, Ted sat silently in the back seat, staring out the window. Then he spoke. His voice was quiet, almost defeated. He said, "I wish you had killed me." Lee didn't respond. He didn't know what to say. But within hours, investigators from Tallahassee, Lake City, and Jacksonville would arrive at the jail. They would compare evidence, run fingerprints, and connect the dots. And they would realize that the man in custody wasn't just a car thief. He was Ted Bundy, the escaped fugitive, the serial killer, the monster. Ted Bundy's capture made national headlines. After nearly 7 weeks on the run, he was finally in custody. But the legal battle was just beginning. In May 1978, a Florida grand jury indicted Ted on charges of first-degree murder, attempted murder, and burglary for the Chi Omega attacks. He would stand trial in Miami, and the proceedings would be unlike anything the country had ever seen. The trial was scheduled for June 1979, more than a year after his arrest. During that time, Ted sat in jail, representing himself and preparing his defense. He believed he could outsmart the prosecutors, charm the jury, and walk away a free man. He had always believed he was smarter than everyone else, but this time he was wrong. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Forensic experts had matched the bite marks on Lisa Levy's body to castings of Ted's teeth. Witnesses had placed him at the Chi Omega house on the night of the murders. Nita Neary, the sorority member who had seen him leaving, identified him in court, and physical evidence from the stolen van tied him to Kimberly Leach's abduction and murder. Ted's charm couldn't save him. Not this time. The trial of Ted Bundy became a media spectacle. It was the first trial in American history to be televised nationally, and millions of people tuned in to watch. Reporters from 5 continents descended on Miami, filling the courtroom and broadcasting every moment to the world. Ted, ever the showman, seemed to relish the attention. He smiled at cameras, joked with reporters, and cross-examined witnesses with theatrical flair. But beneath the charm, the case was unraveling. Ted's defense team had negotiated a plea deal with prosecutors. If Ted pleaded guilty to the murders of Lisa Levy, Margaret Bowman, and Kimberly Leach, he would receive a firm 75-year prison sentence. No death penalty. His lawyers urged him to take it. They knew the evidence was too strong, and the risk of execution was too great. But Ted refused. His legal team believed he couldn't bring himself to admit guilt in front of the world. He couldn't stand the idea of people seeing him as a monster, so he rejected the deal and gambled on a trial. It was the worst decision of his life. The trial lasted just a few weeks, but the testimony was devastating. Connie Hastings, a Chi Omega sorority member, testified that she saw Ted Bundy near the house on the night of the murders. Nita Neary described seeing him leave the house, clutching a piece of firewood. She pointed at Ted in the courtroom and said, without hesitation, that he was the man she saw. Then came the forensic evidence. Dr. Richard Suviron, a forensic odontologist, explained how he had compared the bite marks on Lisa Levy's body to dental castings of Ted's teeth. The marks matched perfectly. Dr. Lowell Levine, another odontology expert, confirmed the findings. The jury was shown enlarged photographs of the bite marks alongside images of Ted's teeth. The match was undeniable. Ted tried to discredit the evidence, arguing that bite mark analysis wasn't reliable. But the jury didn't buy it. They had seen the photos. They had heard the testimony. And they had seen Ted's arrogance on full display. On July 24, 1979, after less than 7 hours of deliberation, the jury found Ted Bundy guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder and 3 counts of attempted murder. Judge Edward Cowart sentenced him to death. 6 months later, Ted stood trial again, this time in Orlando for the murder of Kimberly Leach. The evidence was just as strong. Witnesses testified that they had seen Ted near the school on the day Kimberly disappeared. One witness saw him forcing a young girl into a white van. Forensic experts matched fibers from Ted's jacket to fibers found on Kimberly's body and inside the stolen van. The fibers had a rare manufacturing defect, making them almost impossible to attribute to coincidence. Ted's defense was weak. He had no alibi, no explanation, and no credible witnesses to support his claims of innocence. On February 7, 1980, The jury found him guilty of first-degree murder and kidnapping. 3 days later, Judge Wallace Jopling sentenced Ted to death for a third time. As the sentence was announced, Ted stood up and shouted at the jury, "Tell them they were wrong, but they weren't wrong." The evidence was clear, the victims were real, and Ted Bundy's run was finally over. He was transferred to Florida State Prison in Rayford, where he would spend the next 9 years on death row, exhausting every legal appeal he could find. Life on death row was a strange existence for Ted Bundy. He was no longer the charming law student or the charismatic escape artist. He was inmate number 010559, waiting to die. But Ted didn't give up. He filed appeal after appeal, challenging every aspect of his convictions. He argued that the bite mark evidence was unreliable. He claimed his trial had been unfair due to media coverage. He insisted that he hadn't received adequate legal representation, despite the fact that he had chosen to represent himself. For years, his appeals worked. Execution dates were set and then postponed as courts reviewed his cases. Ted also gave interviews to psychologists and FBI agents and journalists, offering insights into his crimes in exchange for more time. He never fully confessed, always speaking about his murders in the third person, as if he were analyzing someone else's behavior. But slowly, the details emerged. He admitted to killing at least 30 young women across 7 states. He described how he would scout locations, identify victims, and lure them to his car using fake injuries or impersonating authority figures. He talked about revisiting crime scenes and spending time with the bodies of his victims. It was chilling, and it was true. By the late 1980s, Ted's appeals were running out. Courts had reviewed his cases multiple times, and every appeal had been denied. His execution date was set for January 24, 1989. As the date approached, Ted made a final desperate attempt to delay his death. He began confessing to unsolved murders, offering to provide details in exchange for more time. He contacted detectives from Washington, Colorado, Utah, and Idaho, telling them he could help solve cold cases. He confessed to killing 8 women in Washington whose bodies had been found on Taylor Mountain. He admitted to murdering women in Idaho and Colorado, whose remains had never been recovered. He even confessed to kidnapping and killing 12-year-old Kimberly Leach, providing details that only the killer would know. But investigators saw through his strategy. Ted wasn't confessing out of remorse. He was confessing to buy time. The courts refused to grant any more delays. Ted Bundy's execution would proceed as scheduled. On the night of January 23rd, Ted met with his mother for the last time. She begged him to tell the truth, to explain why he had done these terrible things. But Ted had no answers. Or if he did, he kept them to himself. January 24th, 1989, at 7 in the morning, Ted Bundy was escorted from his cell to the execution chamber at Florida State Prison. Hundreds of people had gathered outside the prison gates, some holding signs that read "Burn Bundy, Burn" and "Tuesday is Friday." Inside, witnesses filled a small room adjacent to the execution chamber. Among them were family members of Ted's victims, law enforcement officers who had worked on his cases, and journalists documenting the final moments of one of America's most infamous serial killers. Ted was strapped into the electric chair, a device known as Old Sparky. Electrodes were attached to his head and leg. A hood was placed over his face. The warden asked if Ted had any last words. Ted's voice was calm, almost detached. He said, "I'd like to give my love to my family and friends." Then the switch was flipped. 2,000 volts of electricity surged through Ted's body. his hands clenched, his body strained against the restraints. The current ran for 1 minute. Then it stopped. At 7:06 in the morning, Ted Bundy was pronounced dead. He was 42 years old. Outside the prison, the crowd erupted in cheers. Ted Bundy's death didn't bring closure. It brought relief, yes, justice, perhaps. But closure, that was something the families of his victims would never truly have. For many, the questions remained. Why did Ted kill? What drove him to commit such unspeakable acts? Psychologists and criminal profilers have spent decades analyzing Ted's life, trying to understand what made him a killer. Some point to his childhood, the confusion over his parentage, the anger he felt toward his mother for lying to him. Others suggest he had an underlying personality disorder, a complete lack of empathy that allowed him to view other people as objects rather than human beings. Ted himself offered contradictory explanations over the years. In some interviews, he blamed pornography, claiming that violent images had corrupted his mind and fueled his fantasies. In others, he suggested that alcohol had lowered his inhibitions and allowed his darker urges to surface. But most experts believe these were excuses, attempts to shift blame away from himself. The truth, they say, is simpler and more terrifying. Ted Bundy killed because he wanted to, because he enjoyed it, because he could. And that's what makes him so chilling. Ted Bundy's escapes remain some of the most audacious in American criminal history. The first escape from the Aspen courthouse was bold, reckless, and ultimately short-lived. Ted jumped out of a second-story window in broad daylight, injured himself in the fall, and still managed to evade capture for 6 days. But it was the second escape that truly shocked the nation. Ted spent months planning it, starving himself to fit through a tiny hole in the ceiling, smuggling in money, and studying every detail of the jail's layout. And when he finally made his move, he succeeded. He walked out the front door of the Garfield County Jail and disappeared for 47 days. During that time, he traveled across the country, living under fake names, and committed some of the most horrific crimes of his entire killing spree. If Officer David Lee hadn't pulled him over in Pensacola, Ted might have kept running. He might have killed again, and he might never have been caught. But he was caught, and the evidence against him was overwhelming. Ted's escapes bought him time, but they also sealed his fate. The story of Ted Bundy raises uncomfortable questions about our justice system. How did a man facing murder charges escape from a courthouse in broad daylight? How did he escape from jail a second time, despite being one of the most wanted fugitives in the country? The answer is a combination of overconfidence, poor security, and Ted's intelligence. The Garfield County Jail wasn't designed to hold someone like Ted. It was a small, understaffed facility that relied on routine rather than high security. Ted exploited every weakness. He studied the guards, the building, the schedules. He manipulated the system to his advantage, and when the moment was right, he acted. His escapes exposed serious flaws, P.E. continue, in the way high-profile inmates were managed. After Ted's second escape, jails and prisons across the country reevaluated their security measures. Policies were changed, training was improved, and procedures were put in place to prevent another Ted Bundy from slipping through the cracks. But the damage was done. During his time on the run, Ted killed at least 3 more people, including a 12-year-old girl. Those lives might have been saved if the system had been stronger. And that's a burden the justice system still carries today. Ted Bundy's legacy is a dark one. He is remembered not as a person, but as a symbol of pure evil. His name has become synonymous with serial murder, manipulation, and depravity. But Ted's story is also a cautionary tale. It's a reminder that monsters don't always look like monsters. Ted was handsome, articulate, and charming. He worked on political campaigns, volunteered at a crisis hotline, and attended law school. People liked him. Women trusted him, and he used that trust to destroy lives. Psychologists call it the halo effect, the tendency to assume that attractive, charismatic people are also good people. Ted weaponized that assumption. He used his charm to disarm his victims, to gain their trust, and to lure them into situations where they were vulnerable. And once he had them, he showed no mercy. Ted's case also changed the way law enforcement investigates serial crimes. Before Ted, police departments rarely communicated across state lines. Each agency worked its own cases in isolation, unaware that similar crimes were happening elsewhere. Ted exploited that lack of communication, moving from state to state, leaving a trail of victims that wasn't connected until it was almost too late. After Ted, investigators began sharing information more freely, creating databases and task forces to track patterns across jurisdictions. Ted Bundy helped create the modern era of criminal profiling. One of the most disturbing aspects of Ted Bundy's story is the cult of personality that formed around him. Even after his arrest, even after his conviction, even after his execution, there were people who refused to believe he was guilty. Some women wrote him love letters in prison, expressing their belief in his innocence and their desire to be with him. One woman, Carole Ann Boone, went so far as to marry Ted during his trial. She even gave birth to his daughter while he was on death row, though the details of how that happened remain murky, as conjugal visits were not officially allowed. Ted's charm didn't disappear just because he was in prison. He continued to manipulate people, convincing some that he was a victim of a flawed justice system, that the evidence against him had been fabricated, that he was innocent. It's a phenomenon that still exists today. There are online communities dedicated to defending Ted Bundy, arguing that he was wrongfully convicted, that the real killer was never caught. These groups ignore the overwhelming evidence, the confessions, the eyewitness testimony. They cling to a fantasy version of Ted, the charming law student who couldn't possibly be a murderer. It's a testament to how powerful charisma can be, even in the face of undeniable truth. Ted Bundy's victims deserve to be remembered, not as statistics or case files, but as real people with real lives. Linda Haley was a psychology student who loved skeeting and had dreams of working with children. Donna Manson was a free-spirited artist who played the flute and wrote poetry. Jorgen Hawkins was a cheerful, popular student who was planning to spend the summer in Europe. Karen Campbell was a nurse who was on a ski vacation with her fiancé. Kimberly Leach was a 12-year-old girl who loved animals and dreamed of becoming a veterinarian. These women and girls were daughters, sisters, friends. They had hopes and dreams and futures. And Ted Bundy took all of that away. For some families, the pain never faded. They spent years searching for answers, attending trials, and reliving the worst moments of their lives over and over again. Some never got to bury their loved ones. Their remains never recovered. Others had to endure the public spectacle of Ted's trials, watching him smile and joke while their daughter's murders were discussed in graphic detail. The victims of Ted Bundy are more than names on a list. They are reminders of the real cost of evil. The question that haunts everyone who studies Ted Bundy is simple. Could he have been stopped sooner? The answer is complicated. There were warning signs throughout Ted's life. As a child, he exhibited disturbing behavior, placing knives around his sleeping aunt, engaging in animal cruelty, and building traps to hurt other children. As a teenager, he was arrested multiple times for burglary and theft. As an adult, he dated women and manipulated them, stealing from them and lying constantly. But none of these behaviors, on their own, predicted what he would become. Plenty of people have difficult childhoods and don't become serial killers. Plenty of people commit petty crimes and never escalate to murder. The truth is, Ted Bundy was good at hiding. He wore a mask of normalcy, so convincing that even the people closest to him didn't see the darkness beneath. His girlfriend, Elizabeth Cloifer, suspected him and reported him to police multiple times, but even she struggled to believe he was capable of murder. Ann Rule, the true crime writer who worked alongside Ted at a crisis hotline, described him as kind and empathetic. She had no idea what he was doing in his spare time. Ted's ability to compartmentalize, to separate his public persona from his private actions, made him nearly impossible to detect until it was too late. Looking back, there were moments when Ted could have been caught earlier. After the Lake Sammamish abductions in 1974, multiple people reported him to police, including his girlfriend and a coworker. His name was on a list of suspects, but detectives didn't prioritize him. He was a clean-cut law student with no adult criminal record. He didn't fit the profile they were expecting. By the time they realized their mistake, Ted had moved to Utah and continued killing. In Utah, Ted was arrested for possession of burglary tools in 1975. Police found handcuffs, a ski mask, rope, and other suspicious items in his car. They also found evidence linking him to the Duranch kidnapping. But even after he was convicted of kidnapping, authorities didn't have enough evidence to charge him with murder. It took months of investigation, coordination between multiple states, and forensic breakthroughs to finally connect Ted to the murders. If police had acted more aggressively earlier, if they had shared information more effectively, if they had taken the early tips more seriously, lives might have been saved. But hindsight is always clearer than foresight, and Ted Bundy was a master at exploiting the gaps in the system. Ted Bundy's story has been told countless times in books, documentaries, movies, and television shows. Some portrayals focus on the crimes, emphasizing the horror and brutality of his actions. Others focus on the investigation, highlighting the detectives who worked tirelessly to bring him to justice. Still others focus on Ted himself, attempting to understand the psychology of a serial killer. But there's a danger in telling Ted's story too often, in too much detail. It risks glorifying him, turning him into a dark celebrity, rather than a cautionary tale. Ted enjoyed the attention. He thrived on it. Even in prison, he gave interviews, posed for photos, and played the role of the misunderstood genius. Every documentary, every movie, every book that focuses on Ted gives him exactly what he wanted: immortality. That's why it's so important to shift the focus, to tell the stories of the victims, not the killer, to honor the detectives, the families, and the survivors who fought for justice. Ted Bundy doesn't deserve to be remembered as anything other than what he was: a coward who preyed on innocent people, a manipulator who hid behind charm, and a killer who showed no remorse. His escapes were audacious, yes, but they were also the desperate acts of a man who knew he was guilty and couldn't face the consequences. So what can we learn from Ted Bundy's escapes? First, that intelligence and charm can be dangerous when combined with malicious intent. Ted used his mind not to contribute to society, but to exploit its weaknesses. He studied the justice system, identified its flaws, and manipulated it to his advantage. His escapes weren't miracles. They were the result of careful planning, patience, and a willingness to take enormous risks. Second, that security is only as strong as its weakest link. The Garfield County Jail failed because it underestimated Ted. Guards ignored warning signs. Procedures weren't followed, and Ted walked out the front door. Third, that evil doesn't always announce itself. Ted looked normal. He sounded normal. He acted normal. And that made him all the more dangerous. His story is a reminder to trust our instincts, to pay attention to red flags, and to take threats seriously, even when they come from people who seem harmless. Finally, Ted's escapes remind us that justice, while sometimes slow, is inevitable. Ted ran, he hid, he killed. But in the end, he was caught, he was tried, and he was executed. His victims got justice, even if they didn't get closure. There's one more question that lingers. Did Ted Bundy ever feel remorse? In his final interviews, Ted spoke about his crimes with a detached, clinical tone, as if he were discussing someone else's actions. He talked about the entity inside him, a dark force that took over and committed these terrible acts. But psychologists who interviewed him didn't buy it. They saw it as another manipulation, another attempt to avoid responsibility. Dr. Dorothy Lewis, a psychiatrist who studied Ted extensively, believed he had a dissociative disorder, a mental condition that allowed him to compartmentalize his actions and avoid confronting the reality of what he had done. But even she admitted that Ted showed no genuine remorse. He cried during some interviews, but the tears seemed performative, designed to elicit sympathy rather than express genuine emotion. Ann Rule, who knew Ted better than almost anyone, wrote that he was incapable of empathy. She described him as the very definition of heartless evil. Polly Nelson, one of his defense attorneys, agreed. She said Ted was a sadistic sociopath who took pleasure from another human's pain. If Ted ever felt sorry for what he had done, he never showed it, not to his victims' families, not to the courts, not even to himself. Ted Bundy's escapes bought him time, but they didn't change his fate. In the end, he died in the electric chair, just as the courts had sentenced him. His crimes were exposed, his victims were remembered, and his name became a cautionary tale. But the story of Ted Bundy isn't just about one man. It's about the fragility of safety, the importance of vigilance, and the reality that evil exists, often hiding in plain sight. It's about the courage of the survivors who lived through his attacks, the determination of the detectives who refused to give up, and the resilience of the families who continued to fight for justice long after their loved ones were gone. Ted Bundy escaped prison twice. He traveled thousands of miles. He lived under fake names and evaded capture for weeks. But he never escaped the truth, and he never escaped the consequences. His story is a reminder that no matter how smart someone thinks they are, no matter how carefully they plan, justice has a way of catching up. It may take time, it may take effort, but it comes. And when Ted Bundy's story is told, the focus should always be on the victims, not the killer. On the lives that were stolen, not the man who stole them. On the justice that was served, not the evil that tried to escape it. In the end, Ted Bundy's legacy is one of darkness. But within that darkness are glimmers of light, the detectives who never stopped searching, the witnesses who came forward despite their fear, the forensic experts who turned bite marks and fibers into evidence that couldn't be denied. Ted Bundy thought he could outsmart the system. He thought his charm, his intelligence, and his carefully constructed lies would protect him forever. But he was wrong. The truth always comes out. Evil always leaves a trail, and justice, while imperfect, still exists. Ted Bundy escaped prison twice in 6 months. He killed at least 30 women. He terrorized an entire nation, but he didn't get away with it. He died in a Florida execution chamber, surrounded by the ghosts of the lives he destroyed. And perhaps that's the real lesson of Ted Bundy's story, that no matter how far you run, no matter how many masks you wear, you can never truly escape yourself. Ted Bundy spent his entire life running from the truth, but in the end, the truth was waiting, and it didn't blink. Ted Bundy's true prison break remains one of the most daring prison escapes in American history. This real prison escape story proves that even the most notorious criminals can exploit weaknesses in the justice system. His dramatic prison escape and subsequent jailbreak shocked the nation, creating a true crime documentary moment that's still studied today. While famous prison escapes like Alcatraz capture our imagination, Bundy's death row escape attempt and ultimate capture remind us that justice prevails. This true crime story isn't just about a prison breakout. It's about the real crime story of evil hiding behind charm. If you found this daring escape fascinating, share your thoughts below and explore more true crime prison stories on our channel.